Every night, a small puppy curled up outside the doors of Greenwood General Hospital, braving the cold and darkness. Dr. Daniel Carter finally took notice and uncovered the truth behind the puppy's behavior. It was a revelation that moved him to tears. It was a frosty winter evening, and the golden glow of the hospital's lights reflected off the icy pavement. Patients and visitors hurried in and out, bundled in coats and scarves. But amidst the bustling scene, a small puppy with matted fur and tired eyes lay curled up just outside the entrance. Despite the bitter cold, the little dog didn't seek warmth or food. He simply stayed staring intently at the doors as though waiting for someone. Dr. Daniel Carter, a senior pediatrician known for his no-nonsense attitude, noticed the puppy. As he exited the hospital, the dog's unwavering gaze stopped him in his tracks. "What's he doing here?" he muttered, tightening his scarf. A passing nurse overheard him. "He's been here every evening for weeks, Dr. Carter." "Poor thing. Must be waiting for someone inside." Daniel frowned, his gaze lingering on the small creature. Something about the dog tugged at his heart. The next night he saw the puppy again, curled up in the same spot, snowflakes clinging to his fur. Unable to ignore the sight, he crouched down near him. "You're still here, huh?" he said softly, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The puppy lifted his head slightly, ears twitching but didn't move. His deep, soulful eyes met Daniel's, and for the first time in a long while the doctor felt something stir inside him. "Do you have an owner?" he asked, though he knew the dog wouldn't answer. A janitor passing by chuckled. "Talking. Can do that mutt, Doc? He's been here for weeks. Some say he's waiting for a patient." Daniel glanced back at the hospital. Was the puppy's owner inside? Or worse, had they already passed? Over the next few nights he began to notice the dog more and more. Each evening as he left work, the little creature was there, never barking or begging, just watching. One particularly cold evening, unable to bear the sight of the shivering pup, Daniel brought him a small blanket from his car. "Here, this should help," he murmured, draping it over the dog. To his surprise, the puppy allowed it. His big, trusting eyes met Daniel's once more, before turning back to the hospital doors. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of the lonely dog haunted him. Was he neglecting someone in need? His job was to save lives, but here was a life slipping through the cracks. The next day during lunch, he asked the hospital receptionist if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Not that I know of," she replied, typing on her keyboard. "You think he belongs to a patient?" "Maybe," Daniel said, his mind racing. "Let me know if anyone asks about him." By the end of the week, his curiosity had turned into quiet determination. He started leaving food and water for the puppy each night, and by morning, the bowls were empty. Yet despite his efforts, the dog remained distant, his loyalty seemingly tied to the hospital doors. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave, he noticed a group of nurses huddled around. The puppy, Sarah, a kind-hearted nurse, was stroking the dog's head. "He finally let someone touch him," she said, smiling as Daniel approached. "It's like he's starting to trust us." Daniel knelt down, hesitating before reaching out. His fingers brushed against the soft, matted fur, and the puppy didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Daniel, his eyes brimming with hope and sadness. In that moment, Daniel knew he had to find out the truth. Why was this little soul so devoted to the hospital? Who or what was he waiting for? Dr. Daniel Carter sat at his desk, distracted. The mystery of the little dog outside Greenwood General Hospital weighed on his mind. Every night, the puppy remained by the entrance, his eyes filled with unshakable devotion. Who was he waiting for? Determined to find answers, Daniel approached Sarah, the nurse who had bonded with the dog. "We need to do more," he told her. "That dog isn't here by accident," Sarah nodded. "I have a friend at an animal shelter. Maybe they can check if he's microchipped." That evening, Sarah brought a leash and coaxed the puppy into letting her slip it on. To their surprise, he didn't resist. He trembled slightly but followed them inside. At the shelter, the staff scanned the dog for a microchip. "Nothing," the technician said with a frown. "No registration." Daniel sighed. "So what now?" "We can post his photo online," Sarah suggested. "Maybe someone will recognize him." Though Daniel wasn't convinced anyone would come forward, he agreed. By the next day, the puppy's picture was posted on local forums and social media, but days passed with no response. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself growing attached to the little dog. Though he hadn't officially adopted him, he stayed outside longer each night, bringing Him food, talking to him. The puppy never barked or whined. He simply sat, waiting. One evening, as Daniel sat on the hospital steps beside the dog, he spoke aloud. "You know, I never really thought about loyalty much," he said softly. "My job is about routine, fixing people, moving on." The puppy tilted his head as if listening. "You're different," Daniel continued. "You don't move on. You stay." That night, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The next day, he visited the hospital records office. "Have we had any recent patients who lived alone?" he asked. After searching through files, a name surfaced. Edward Langley, an elderly man admitted 3 weeks earlier who had passed away shortly after. He had no known relatives. Daniel's breath caught. Was this the man the puppy was waiting for? That evening, he sat beside the little dog once more. "Edward Langley," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched slightly. Daniel's chest tightened. If Edward had been the owner, then this dog wasn't just waiting. He was grieving. The weight of responsibility settled over Daniel. He couldn't leave the dog alone anymore. He had to find a way to help him move forward. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, he'd find something he had been missing too. The revelation of Edward Langley's name changed everything. Dr. Daniel Carter now knew the truth. The little dog wasn't just a stray. He had belonged to someone who was no longer there. The thought of it made Daniel's chest tighten. The puppy had been waiting outside the hospital for weeks, hoping for a person who would never return. That night, Daniel found himself unable to focus on anything else. He sat in his car outside the hospital, watching the dog curled up near the entrance, his small body shivering against the cold pavement. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't right," he muttered. Making a decision, he stepped out of his car and approached the dog. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, kneeling beside him. The dog lifted his head, his tired brown eyes locking onto Daniel's. "You can't stay out here forever," Daniel continued. "It's freezing." The dog didn't move, his gaze drifting back toward the hospital doors, as if still expecting Edward to come through them. Daniel sighed. He wasn't an animal person. His life revolved around work. Long hours, stressful days, and little time for anything else. But this situation tugged at something deep inside him. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a leash Sarah had given him earlier that day. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm," he said, gently slipping the leash over the dog's neck. To his surprise, the puppy didn't resist. He simply looked up at Daniel, trusting him in a way that made the doctor's throat tighten. Daniel led the dog to his car and opened the passenger side door. "Hop in," he said. The puppy hesitated, glancing back at the hospital one last time, before finally climbing into the seat. As Daniel drove home, he found himself glancing at the dog beside him. "You're really something, you know that," he said. The dog just curled up, resting his head against the seat. When they arrived at Daniel's house, he led the dog inside, uncertain of what to do next. His home was neat, minimal, and devoid of personal touches. He had never needed much, just a place to sleep before heading back to work. This is it," Daniel said awkwardly, watching as the dog sniffed around. Realizing the puppy was likely hungry, he rummaged through his kitchen for something suitable. Settling on a bowl of plain chicken, he placed it on the floor. The dog sniffed it hesitantly before eating, his tail wagging faintly. Daniel watched him in silence. "This wasn't part of my plan," he muttered. After eating, the dog curled up on a blanket Daniel had set in the corner. The doctor exhaled, rubbing his temples. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. But as he watched the small dog sleep, he realized something. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel so empty. The next day, Daniel woke up to the sound of soft paw steps padding across the floor. The dog had made himself at home, resting near the foot of the couch where Daniel had fallen asleep. He stared at the little creature, realizing he had a decision to make. He couldn't keep calling him the dog. "What do I even name you?" Daniel mused aloud. He thought back to Edward Langley. What would he have called his beloved companion? As he pondered, the dog suddenly lifted his head and wagged his tail at the sound of one word. "Max?" The dog's ears perked up and he let out a soft bark. Daniel smirked. "Max it is." After feeding Max, Daniel left for work. It was the first time he felt reluctant to leave his house. As he locked the door, Max sat by the window watching him go. At the hospital, Daniel couldn't focus. Between patient rounds, he found himself thinking about Max. He had never considered having a pet, yet here he was, worrying about a dog he had brought home less than 24 hours ago. During his break, he ran into Sarah. "I took him home," he admitted. Sarah's eyes widened. "You? Dr. Carter, the man who once told me he didn't even have time for a houseplant." Daniel sighed. Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, but I couldn't leave him out there." Sarah smiled. "That's a big step. Have you thought about keeping him?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know yet." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think he's already chosen you." Daniel knew she was probably right. Uncovering the past later that evening, Daniel found himself thinking about Edward again. If Max belonged to him, there had to be more to the story. Determined, he drove to the address listed in Edward's hospital records. The house was a small, worn-down place on the outskirts of town. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the garden was overgrown, but it still had a warmth to it. Knocking on the door, Daniel waited. A moment later, a neighbor, a woman in her 60s, approached from next door. "Are you looking for Edward?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I'm Dr. Carter. I treated him at the hospital." He hesitated. "I think I have his dog." The woman gasped. "You found Max?" Daniel nodded. "He was waiting outside the hospital." Tears filled her eyes. That poor boy. He loved Edward more than anything. Daniel's heart ached as the woman invited him inside. The house was quiet, filled with books and old photographs. She showed him a picture of Edward sitting on the porch. Max curled up beside him. "They were inseparable," she said softly. "Edward had no family left. Max was everything to him." Daniel clenched his jaw. "That explains why he wouldn't leave." The woman nodded. "Max didn't know Edward was gone. He was just waiting for him to come home." Daniel swallowed hard. He had known Max was grieving, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more painful. The neighbor smiled gently. "I'm glad he found you." Daniel exhaled. "I don't know if I can take care of him the way Edward did." She shook her head. "Edward would be happy knowing Max has someone who cares." As Daniel drove home, Max sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. "I think we found your story, buddy," Daniel murmured, "but I still don't know what to do next." Max turned to him, wagging his tail softly. Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, I know. One step at a time." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something new, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Dr. Daniel Carter never thought he'd have a dog in his life, but Max had already changed that. The little pup had spent weeks outside Greenwood General Hospital, waiting for his deceased owner, Edward Langley. Now, Max had found his way into Daniel's home, and whether he admitted it or not, into his heart. It had been 3 days since Daniel brought Max home. At first, the adjustment was awkward. Daniel was used to solitude, his life revolving around work and little else. But now, everywhere he turned, Max was there, following him from room to room, curling up near his feet while he read, watching him from the window as he left for work. That morning, as Daniel grabbed his coat, he noticed Max sitting by the door, wagging his tail expectantly. "You can't come with me, buddy," Daniel said, feeling a twinge of guilt. "Hospitals don't allow dogs." Max let out a soft whine but didn't move. Daniel sighed. "I'll be back, I promise." As he locked the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for Max, goodbyes were never just goodbyes. At the hospital, Daniel found himself distracted. His mind kept drifting to the small dog waiting at home. He was used to patients depending on him, but this was different. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a creature who had lost everything and still hoped for something more. During his break, Daniel ran into Sarah in the staff lounge. "So how's dog ownership treating you?" she teased, sipping her coffee. Daniel exhaled. "I don't know, it's different." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Different good or different bad?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know yet." Sarah smiled knowingly. "You care about him." Daniel rolled his eyes. "I'm just making sure he's okay." "Uh-huh," Sarah smirked. "You're starting to sound like someone who's keeping him." Daniel had no response to that. That evening, as he drove home, he realized how eager he was to see Max. As soon as he opened the door, the dog's tail wagged wildly, and he bounded toward Daniel, greeting him as if he had been gone for weeks. Daniel chuckled. Okay, I get it. You missed me." Max barked happily, running in circles. Daniel crouched down, rubbing behind Max's ears. "I missed you too, buddy." The words left his mouth before he even realized it. He had missed Max. That night, as Max curled up beside him, Daniel knew what he had to do next. He had to learn more about Edward Langley, the man Max had loved so dearly. The next afternoon, Daniel drove back to Edward's house, this time bringing Max along. As they stepped onto the porch, Max hesitated, sniffing the air. His tail wagged, cautiously his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. Edward's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stepped outside when she saw them. "Oh my," she breathed, her eyes softening as she spotted Max. "He looks so much better already." Daniel nodded. "He's been doing well. I wanted to ask you more about Edward." Mrs. Henderson invited them inside. The house was quiet, filled with small traces of the man who once lived there. Books stacked neatly on the shelves, an old armchair near the fireplace, a faded photograph of Edward and Max sitting on the coffee table. "He was a good man," Mrs. Henderson said, settling into a chair. "Kept to himself mostly, but he had a kind heart. After his wife passed, Max became his whole world." Daniel listened, glancing at Max, who was sniffing around the room with careful curiosity. "Edward took Max everywhere," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Grocery store, post office, even the library. He used to say, 'As long as I have Max, I'm never alone.'" Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He could see it now, the unwavering bond between Edward and Max. "He must have been terrified when Edward didn't come home," Daniel murmured. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "That's why he stayed outside the hospital. He didn't understand." Daniel looked at Max, who had curled up beside Edward's armchair, resting his head on the worn fabric as if waiting for his owner to return. "He still loves him," Daniel whispered. Mrs. Henderson smiled sadly. "Love like that doesn't just disappear." As Daniel drove home, Max sat in the passenger seat staring out the window. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Daniel asked, glancing at the dog. "I can't replace Edward, but I can make sure you're never alone again." Max turned to him, wagging his tail softly. Daniel exhaled, gripping the wheel. He had been resisting the inevitable, but deep down he knew the truth. Max wasn't just a temporary guest in his home. Max was family. When they got home, Daniel knelt beside Max, rubbing his fur. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. "Want to stay with me?" Max licked his face enthusiastically, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. Daniel laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had spent years avoiding attachments, keeping people at arm's length, but Max had walked into his life and changed everything. That night, as Max lay beside him, Daniel finally let himself accept it. He wasn't just taking care of Max, Max was taking care of him too. The decision had been made. Max was staying. Dr. Daniel Carter hadn't planned on having a dog, but somehow Max had found his way into his home and heart. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much deeper. Now came the real challenge, learning how to live with a dog. The next morning, Daniel woke up to a wet nose nudging his hand. He groaned, opening one eye to find Max staring at him expectantly, tail wagging. "You're really a morning person, huh?" Daniel muttered, rubbing his eyes. Max let out a short bark and ran to the front door. Daniel sighed, throwing on a jacket and grabbing the leash. "All right, let's go." As they stepped outside, the crisp morning air jolted Daniel awake. Max trotted ahead eagerly, sniffing every tree and mailbox along the way. "You act like you've never seen a sidewalk before," Daniel mused as Max pulled him forward. Despite himself, Daniel found the walk oddly calming. The quiet streets, the rhythmic sound of Max's paws against the pavement. It was a moment of peace he hadn't realized he needed. By the time they returned home, Daniel felt more awake than he usually did after his morning coffee. Maybe having a dog wasn't so bad after all. Later that day, as Daniel prepared for work, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found Sarah standing there, arms crossed. "You didn't tell me you officially adopted him," she said with a smirk. Daniel sighed. "I didn't think I needed to make an announcement." Sarah peered inside, spotting Max lying on the couch. "He looks happy." Daniel nodded. "He's adjusting, I think." Sarah stepped inside, reaching down to pet Max. "And how are you?" "Adjusting?" Daniel hesitated. "It's different." Sarah smiled knowingly. "You're learning how to care about someone outside of work." Daniel rolled his eyes. "I already care about people. I'm a doctor." Sarah shook her head. "That's different. Patients come and go, but Max, he's here every day. And that kind of connection is something you've been avoiding for years." Daniel frowned. "I haven't been avoiding." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, maybe I have." Sarah laughed. "Well, welcome to the world of emotional attachment, Dr. Carter." Daniel couldn't help but chuckle. "It's exhausting." Sarah patted his shoulder. "You'll get used to it." Over the next week, Daniel's life changed in ways he never expected. Mornings began with walks instead of a rushed cup of coffee. Evenings were spent tossing a ball for Max instead of reviewing medical journals. At work, he found himself checking the security cameras on his phone, making sure Max was okay at home. It was a strange feeling, worrying about someone waiting for him. One evening, after a long shift, Daniel returned home to find Max sitting by the door, tail wagging excitedly. "You really waited all day, didn't you?" Daniel murmured, kneeling beside him. Max licked his face, and for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel so alone. As he made dinner, Max sat by his feet, watching his every move. "You're not getting my steak," Daniel warned. Max tilted, his head wagging his tail hopefully. Daniel sighed, cutting off a small piece. "Fine, but don't get used to it." Max devoured the treat, looking up at Daniel with pure joy. Daniel chuckled. "You're impossible." Despite their growing bond, Daniel knew Max had unfinished business. He had spent weeks waiting outside the hospital, believing Edward would return. Would he ever truly move on? Hoping for closure, Daniel took Max back to the animal shelter where they had first scanned him for a microchip. The shelter's director, a woman named Linda, greeted them warmly. "He looks like a completely different dog." Daniel nodded. "He's doing well, but I wanted to ask if anyone ever came looking for him. Any updates on the missing pet reports?" Linda checked the records, then shook her head. "Nothing. It's like he only ever had one person." Daniel sighed, glancing at Max. "Yeah, Edward." Linda studied Max thoughtfully. "Dogs grieve, just like people do. But they also learn to love again." Daniel nodded, his grip on Max's leash tightening. "That's what I'm hoping for." As they left the shelter, Max trotted beside Daniel, ears perked up, tail wagging. Maybe he had already started to move on. One evening, as Daniel and Max sat on the couch watching TV, something unexpected happened. A soft whine escaped Max's throat. Daniel turned to find him staring at the door, ears pricked up. "What is it, buddy?" Daniel asked. Max stood, tail lowering, his body tense. He walked to the door and sat down, staring at it. Daniel's heart clenched. He had seen this before, outside the hospital, when Max had waited night after night for Edward. Was he waiting again? Daniel swallowed hard. "He's not coming back, Max." The little dog didn't move. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. Had thought Max was adjusting, but maybe he was still waiting for someone who would never return. Taking a deep breath, Daniel knelt beside him. "You don't have to wait anymore," he murmured. "You have me now." Max's ears twitched, but he didn't look away from the door. Daniel hesitated, then gently picked him up, carrying him back to the couch. Max curled up beside him, pressing his head against Daniel's side. Daniel exhaled, stroking Max's fur. "We're in this together, okay?" Max let out a soft sigh, finally relaxing eyes. The night went on. Daniel realized something. Grief didn't just disappear, it lingered, reshaped itself, found new ways to exist. And maybe that was okay, because even though Max had lost Edward, and Daniel had spent years keeping everyone at a distance, they had found each other, and that was a start. Dr. Daniel Carter had never been one to dwell on emotions. His life was structured, clinical, and predictable, until Max. The little dog had upended everything, forcing him to confront feelings he had long buried. Grief, connection, loyalty. Most of all, Max had reminded him what it meant to truly care. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Daniel had brought Max home, and despite the progress they had made together, one thing remained clear. Max still carried the weight of his past. Some nights Daniel would find him sitting by the front door, his eyes filled with quiet longing. He wasn't just waiting for something, he was waiting for someone, Edward. No matter how much Max had begun to adjust to his new life, a part of him was still searching for the man he had lost. A new beginning. One evening, Daniel sat on the floor, beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "You know," he murmured. "I get it." Max looked up at him, ears twitching. Daniel exhaled. "I lost someone too." His voice was quiet, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. He had spent years avoiding thoughts of his past, burying himself in work to escape the loneliness. But watching Max struggle with his own loss made Daniel realize he had been doing the same thing. "I never talk about her," Daniel admitted, his fingers tracing absent circles in Max's fur. But my mom, she passed away when I was in med school. Max rested his head on Daniel's lap, his small body warm and steady. I stayed busy, threw myself into work, thought if I just kept moving I wouldn't have to feel it. Daniel swallowed. But grief doesn't work like that, does it? Max let out a quiet sigh. Daniel chuckled softly. No, I didn't think so. For the first time in a long time, he let the silence sit between them, unforced, unhurried. Then he made a decision. It was time to help Max and himself find closure. The next morning, Daniel called the hospital's records office to find out where Edward Langley had been buried. It didn't take long to get an answer. That afternoon, Daniel and Max drove to the small cemetery just outside of town. The air was crisp, the sky overcast. As they walked along the quiet rows of headstones, Max trotted ahead, sniffing the ground. Then, suddenly he stopped. His ears perked up, his body stiffening as he stared straight ahead. Daniel followed his gaze. There, beneath a large oak tree, was Edward Langley's grave. Max took a hesitant step forward, then another. Slowly he approached the headstone, his tail lowering as he sniffed the base of the marker. Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. "We found him, buddy." Max sat down, staring at the grave, completely still. Daniel knelt beside him, running a hand over the cold stone. "He loved you a lot, didn't he?" Max let out a soft whine, pressing his nose against the earth. Daniel took a deep breath. "You've been waiting for him all this time." Max stayed silent, his body pressed against the grave as if trying to get just a little closer. And Daniel understood. For weeks, Max had stayed outside the hospital, refusing to leave the last place he had seen Edward. He had endured cold nights, hunger and loneliness, all for the hope that one day his owner would return. Daniel reached out, stroking Max's fur. "He's not coming back, buddy, but you don't have to wait anymore." Max turned to him, his brown eyes filled with something Daniel couldn't quite name. Loss, understanding, maybe even acceptance. After a long moment, Max finally stood and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Daniel closed his eyes, holding him close. They stayed like that for a long time. That evening, as they returned home, something felt different. Max no longer sat by the door. Instead, he curled up beside Daniel on the couch, resting his head on his leg. Daniel ran a hand over Max's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You're staying this time, huh?" he murmured. Max's tail thumped softly against the cushion. Daniel smiled. He had spent so much of his life running from emotions, from attachments, from anything that might slow him down. But Max had taught him something important. Sometimes healing didn't come from forgetting. Sometimes it came from remembering and choosing to move forward anyway. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't afraid to try. Dr. Daniel Carter sat on his couch, absent-mindedly stroking Max's fur. It had been a few days since they visited Edward Langley's grave, and something had changed in the little dog. He no longer lingered by the door, waiting for someone who would never return. Instead, he stayed close to Daniel, his quiet presence filling the once empty home with warmth. Max was healing, and if Daniel was being honest with himself, so was he. The following morning, as Daniel prepared to leave for work, he hesitated at the door. Max sat nearby, watching him, his tail wagging slightly. For weeks, Daniel had dreaded leaving Max alone, afraid the dog would fall back into old habits, waiting, grieving, but today felt different. "I'll be back soon," Daniel said, crouching down. "Okay?" Max let out a soft huff, then trotted over to his dog bed instead of the door. Daniel smiled. Progress. With that, he grabbed his coat and left for the hospital. At lunch, Sarah slid into the seat across from him in the hospital cafeteria, eyeing him with curiosity. "You seem lighter," she observed, sipping her coffee. Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Lighter?" Sarah shrugged, like someone who finally realized he's capable of having feelings. Daniel rolled his eyes. "I had feelings before." "Uh-huh." Sarah smirked. "And yet it took a tiny dog to make you acknowledge them." Daniel sighed. "He's been through a lot." Sarah nodded. "So have you." Daniel frowned but said nothing. Sarah leaned forward. "You know, just because Max lost someone doesn't mean you're just taking care of him. He's taking care of you, too." Daniel hesitated. The idea had crossed his mind, but hearing Sarah say it made it feel more real. Maybe he hadn't just rescued Max. Maybe Max had rescued him, too. That evening, as Daniel and Max sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, a familiar, Car pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Henderson, Edward Langley's neighbor, stepped out carrying a small box. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said with a kind smile. Daniel shook his head. "Not at all. What brings you by?" She knelt to pet Max, her eyes soft. "I wanted to give you this." She handed him the box. It belonged to Edward. Daniel hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a neatly folded blanket, an old leather collar with Max's name on it, and a framed photograph. Edward sitting on his porch, Max curled up beside him. Daniel swallowed hard. He loved that dog more than anything, Mrs. Henderson said gently, but I think he'd be glad to know Max found someone else to love him, too. Daniel glanced at Max, who had already begun sniffing the blanket, his tail wagging slightly. For the first time, there was no sadness in his eyes, just quiet acceptance. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I think so too." That night, after Mrs. Henderson left, Daniel sat on the floor with Max beside him. He carefully unfolded Edward's blanket, laying it in Max's bed. The little dog sniffed it, then curled up on top of it with a contented sigh. Daniel reached out, stroking Max's fur. "You're home now," he murmured. Max tilted his head, then licked Daniel's hand. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, I know. You've always known that, haven't you?" Max's tail thumped against the floor. As Daniel turned off the lights and headed to bed, he glanced back one last time. For the first time, Max wasn't waiting for someone who would never return. He was exactly where he belonged, and so was Daniel.